involved nothing but a tin can. Anybody ever play with a tin can when you were little?
Oh, yes.
You ever played kick the can?
Yes.
It was.
Oh, well, Martha, don't you remember they had street lights then, didn't they?
Yes.
Okay. I can remember going out and playing underneath the street lights. We'd play hide and seek and kick the can. And, you know, the lights then were bright enough that you could play. There weren't that many cars going up and down the street.
True.
And so we played in the streets, basically.
Yeah, everybody did.
Yeah.
And it was safe. It was safe to stay out after dark and play with your friends. But kick the can was a pretty popular game. One of the things that became popular in that period of time was something that someone brought over from the Philippines called a yo-yo. I never was very good at that. If one of you would like to try it, go ahead. But he adapted that from something that the people in the Philippines had used, and they called it a yo-yo because that meant come, because it came back to you. And so that's where the name came from, and it became very popular during this period of time. Girls had more dolls to play with, and boys did a lot of cowboys and Indians type playing with either stick guns or whatever, although sometimes, you know, their parents would buy them toys like that, but a lot of times it was just their imagination. And you did a lot of playing with your friends and neighbors. That was a fun thing to do. And, you know, our kids would probably do more of that if they weren't sitting in front of a television set, but that's how it worked. You know, they did have, in the 20s, vaudeville was very popular, and the Majestic Theater was open. And they had a lot of different entertainment, not only movies, but also different kind of actors that would come in and do different things. I ran across the circular from the Majestic, and it cost 33 cents for an adult to go, and it was 24 cents for a child, and that was the cost to go to the show or to the movies. Later on, when they had movies, they were even cheaper than that. You could go to a movie and buy a candy bar and spend the day for a quarter, and it was a good day of entertainment. And of course, since we started out with silent movies in the early 1920s, but then they developed to sound, and then even before 1930, they came out with movies in color, although they were pretty rare. But that was the most loved pastime of people for entertainment. Now, of course, there were some things that you had at home. Victrolas, record players were popular, and at that time records started coming out. And so, you know, there were many things that were fun for people, a lot of fun for people, and they enjoyed that time, even though it was a hard time. You think about schools, what were the schools doing at that period of time? And one of the reports I read said that the 600,000 teachers in the United States, 30,000 of them had only gone through the 8th grade. And of course they had such strict rules for the teachers, I'm surprised they ever had any. You couldn't be married, you couldn't date, you couldn't stay out late at night. I mean, the rules were really, really strict. And of course, even when I was in high school, if a teacher got pregnant, they had to quit. Do you remember that? I had a Spanish teacher when I was a sophomore in high school, and she was an excellent teacher, and everybody just loved her. Well, she made the mistake of getting pregnant. She was gone the next semester, and we got some dude that didn't know Spanish from a hole in the ground. But she was not allowed to teach because she was expected. So rules were very strict at that period of time, although they did allow people in many rural areas, especially if they could get a young lady who had just gotten out of high school, or even maybe had taken up to the 10th grade, and they would put her in as a teacher to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, and she could only teach them what she knew. She couldn't go any further than that, but it was better than no teaching at all. In the 1920s, we also started having a Jackson County health nurse. And that was something altogether new. It was supplied, I think, through the Red Cross. And she started going into the schools and checking the kids for different problems. It said that one year she found 168 children that needed to have their tonsils taken out. Now back then everybody had their tonsils taken out. I don't know what the reason was, except you've got to remember there were lots and lots of diseases in the 20s that had not been conquered. People died, still died, of cholera, typhus, typhoid fever. They died of tetanus. There was no shots for lockjaw until late in the 20s. Of course, there was nothing for polio, nothing for whooping cough, measles, mumps, all those childhood diseases that can potentially be fatal, and there was no help for that. During the late 1920s, they came up with a vaccination for diphtheria, and that was a really big deal. And all I can remember in first grade, they came around and said, if you haven't had a shot for diphtheria, you're going to get one. And so they went around and gave everybody a shot for diphtheria. I didn't even know what it was, but it was a very dangerous disease, as well as scarlet fever. Now, think about it now. If your children become ill, the first thing you do, you take them to a doctor. Maybe they give them penicillin or an antibiotic, something to conquer this infection. There was no penicillin. There were no antibiotics. And when you called a doctor, usually his only equipment that he carried with him was a stethoscope, and he would look down your throat and maybe listen to your heart, and then maybe he would be able to try to give you something that would help with your problem, but it was a 50-50 chance of him even being able to diagnose what was wrong with you. There were no laboratories, there were no microscopes, there was no way of defining for sure what was wrong with a person. In 1910, they built the hospital here in Seymour, but you know, the mentality at that period of time was you only went to the hospital if you thought you were going to die. And people did not like to go to hospitals, and they didn't trust hospitals, they didn't trust doctors, and possibly that's because they couldn't do them very much good. So, you know, it was a difficult time to be living.
When that nurse went around, I know it's probably before your time, Martha, but I know when I taught at Cortland, had a display out there, there were a lot of little township schools all over.
Right.
You know, we think of just the schools within Seymour proper, but there were a lot of little bitty schools all over the place.
Every little rural community had a school. And every rural community had churches also. Mm-hmm. Churches were very, very much an important part of people's lives. And that was their social as well as their spiritual. They would meet their friends there. They would enjoy good times there. They had pitch-in dinners and all kinds of activities so these people could have fun as well as come and worship. And churches were very, very important to people back then. In this area there were, you know, at least 10 or 12 churches in the city of Seymour alone, but there were churches out in the other areas too. One newspaper article I read that actually made the front page was when they were having a church service at the Sowers Church, which is St. John's, south of here. This huge snake decided to go down the aisle in the middle of the service, and everybody just sat there and ignored it, you know, because they were having church service. It was probably in German back then, and nobody would dare to do anything to disrupt the service, and finally the snake managed to wander its way out.
Been great if the sermon had been about Adam and Eve with the snake coming down right there.
I don't know. But, you know, there were different incidents that happened. I think about different things that were going on during that period of time, but as I said, church was very, very important to people. And then I want you to think a little bit about what came about, what new inventions were created during the 20s, and some of them were really very important. you know, peanut butter was actually discovered in 1890, so it wasn't something new. But all of a sudden in the 20s, it hit, everybody's taste buds seemed to be wanting peanut butter. And the most popular sandwich in America in 1925 was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And that's also the time that Welch's started making their grape jelly, which became very, very popular and still is today. They invented things like Q-tips and Band-Aids. There was a man working for Johnson & Johnson, and he was always, when his wife was cooking in the kitchen and she'd cut herself or burn herself, he had all this cotton, and he'd wad up this little piece of cotton and tape it down to wherever her cut or her burn was. And finally he got the idea you could put all that together, and he took his idea to Johnson & Johnson, and Band-Aids were created. And they're just as popular today as they were then. And I kind of wondered, and never found any information, whether he ever got any credit or any kind of royalties for discovering this, or if they just took his invention and ran with it. That's probably what happened. There was a man named Epperson that set his glass of lemonade with a spoon in it, set it up in the windowsill one time in the winter, and it froze solid. And so he took it out on the spoon and started eating it, and then he created popsicles, which are just as popular today as they were then. But they were first called Eppersicles because he invented them, and he produced these popsicles for people. But one of the things also were the candy bars, and Reese's peanut butter cups were invented in the 20s, and also Baby Ruth candy bars. So there's some back there. You can each take a sample home with you if you like. There were toilet tissue became more popular. Now prior to that, you know what people used? Everybody was always glad to get the new Sears catalog because the old Sears catalog went to the outhouse. Corn cobs were very handy, and even, you know, cloths that would be washed and rewashed, which sounds pretty disgusting, but that's what people had to do at that time. And so toilet tissue made its appearance and became very popular with everybody. Mickey Mouse started coming out on the movie screen, and some of the fads that they had during that period of time, for one thing, there were flagpole sitters, and I don't know if you've ever read about the flagpole sitters, but these people would go up and sit on these flagpoles for days on end. Now, I never did figure out how they took care of their bodily functions with everybody looking at them, but they would build little platforms, and one of the most famous one was called Shipwrecked Kelly, and I think he stayed up on this flagpole contraption for 10 days in full view of everybody. Not sure quite how he did that. Dance marathons became popular, and they finally were outlawed in some cities because these people would dance for 45 hours at a time, and then by the time they were finished dancing, because they would just keep dancing, they'd hold each other up. One would sleep for a while, and then the other one would sleep for a while, and in order to win these big prizes. And so they were having people that were passing out from dehydration. Their feet were bleeding because they danced too long. And so finally some states started absolutely forbidding any kind of dance marathons. During the 1920s, the African American people started doing more in the way of entertainment. A lot of them had flocked to the bigger cities looking for jobs. And a lot of them were very talented in singing and dancing. And so at that time, what they called the Harlem Renaissance went on. And in the Harlem area, they had their own nightclubs, they had their own entertainment, and that's when jazz first began.